You are watching Al Jazeera's extensive and continuing coverage of diplomatic efforts between the United States and Iran aimed at reaching a final peace deal that would end a war that has rattled the Middle East and sent shockwaves through the global economy. What you are seeing right now, a mountaintop, the central Swiss mountains. This is the resort of Burgenstock, the venue that has been chosen to host face-to-face talks between the US and Iran that are meant to include the mediators, Pakistan and Qatar. Those talks right now, everything up in the air. I'm Cyril Vanier, reporting from Lake Lucerne in central Switzerland, and we're going to be bringing you everything you need to know. Two things we're watching. The diplomatic efforts around these talks. They were supposed to happen on Friday. That hasn't happened, but it doesn't mean they won't happen. For the moment, they are delayed. So we're watching all the diplomatic moves from Tehran to Washington. We're also watching what's happening in southern Lebanon, because that is relevant to the direct negotiations between the US and Iran. Remember that paragraph 1 of their current agreement says that there shouldn't be any fighting between their allies, and that means Israel and Hezbollah. So we're watching what's happening in southern Lebanon. At least 40 people have been killed in the last 24 hours in intensive Israeli military strike. This comes after Hezbollah ambushed Israeli soldiers. We'll be covering all of that with our correspondents. We're live across the region. Heidi Pett is in Tyre in southern Lebanon. Alan Fisher, our chief U.S. correspondent, is at the White House. Noor O'Day is in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank, and Mohammed Val will be bringing us all the news from the Iranian capital, Tehran. However, I first start with Al Jazeera's diplomatic editor, James Bays. James, I'd like you to pull back the curtain a little bit for viewers. On an hour-by-hour basis, things have been changing. I mean, things relative to these talks. We thought that right now we'd be seeing direct face-to-face talks between the Iranians and the Americans, and every hour the story changes.
Yeah, there has certainly been a little bit of a wrinkle in all of this, and as you say, things move very fast. In fact, I've been covering the diplomacy on Iran for more than 2 decades, and this is often how it happens. One step forward, another step forward, 3 steps back, another step forward. It made me think today we were standing here in the bright sunshine here by the lake, and then within moments the skies changed. That's a little bit how it is with this diplomacy. Donald Trump was basking in the glory of what he thought was his great deal, his great memorandum of understanding at the G7, and then when it was signed later in the evening in Versailles. And here we've had a little bit of a problem. The dark clouds came for a moment, and I think the problem, we don't know. We know that the US were prepared to come, so it must be Iran, and we think the main problem is Lebanon. You'll be talking about that a little bit later in the programme, but the fact is Lebanon is supposed to be covered by this memorandum of understanding, and it's been breached. Now, perhaps beginning, like we have now, the blue skies are beginning to come through again, because perhaps that ceasefire, I say perhaps because the ceasefire clearly isn't clean at this stage, but ceasefires often aren't clean. Another important note, we thought everyone had cleared out and that this event that was going to take place at the Burgenstock resort was not going to happen. But I can tell you now, the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Qatar has met his Swiss counterpart, his Swiss Foreign Minister counterpart, at the mountain resort the last couple of hours ago. There are people still there. There's still the possibility this could be back on.
So the Qatari Prime Minister is here. We understand that White House advance teams are here. There are banners up around that hotel that are, announcing these talks. This is in preparation, and Switzerland says they're ready to go and ready to host these talks at any moment. But for the moment, the main players, the key players, the heavyweights, they're not here. James Bays, we'll come back to you a little later. But first, we're going to find out what's happening in southern Lebanon. Heidi Pett is in Tyre. Heidi, what's the latest there?
So as night has fallen here in southern Lebanon, there has been a cautious calm, a cautious quiet. Now, that follows the announcement of this ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, which was supposed to take effect at 4 p.m. local time, so about 5 hours ago. Instead, what happened in the first hour after that ceasefire was supposed to take effect, there were at least 13 Israeli airstrikes, many of them concentrated around the city of Nabatea, which has been the focus of intensive Israeli ground activity in recent days. And that is where those 4 Israeli soldiers were killed. Hezbollah says that they ambushed them, that they were able to take out a number of Israeli tanks. And what that sparked was a wave of very, very violent Israeli airstrikes across southern Lebanon and extending as far north as the Bekaa Valley over the course of today. They started before dawn on Friday. And the Ministry of Public Health here says that 47 people were killed since midnight, 97 of them injured. Now, Israel says that what it was hitting was more than 150 Hezbollah targets across the country, but many of the targets that they hit were residential houses, and so we have seen whole families killed. There was an entire family killed in their home before dawn while they were sleeping. There was another family killed while they were actually fleeing their village in the face of these strikes. Their car was passing a building that was targeted by an airstrike, and this entire family was killed. So there is a large number, once again, of women and children among the dead. Now, after the ceasefire was supposed to be implemented, we saw continued Israeli airstrikes. Those have now quietened down. We've had reports in the last couple of minutes about some persistent artillery shelling, but there is a sense of cautious, very cautious quiet here, because people here in Lebanon have really learned not to trust a ceasefire until it really takes hold. And it's not entirely clear yet whether this one will.
And Heidi, one of the things you mentioned is something that Donald Trump has actually criticized Israel for repeatedly in the last few days. The U.S. president has said publicly and openly that he believes Israel is killing too many people in southern Lebanon, specifically too many people who are not Hezbollah. The U.S. president has explained, I'm paraphrasing here, but when Hezbollah strikes Israel, they're going to level a building, sometimes in Beirut, sometimes somewhere else, and they'll kill many people who are not Hezbollah, which is exactly what has happened once again today, and something that Donald Trump has told Israel repeatedly not to do. Heidi, we're getting media reports of a phone call between the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and the Lebanese president, Mr. Aoun. Is that confirmed?
Yes, it is. So that's happened in the last couple of hours. And there's been quite a lot of extensive contact between the Americans and the Lebanese government and the Lebanese president's office over the last couple of months. And the context here is that despite this ceasefire that that's supposed to be implemented between Israel and Hezbollah, which has been enforced, we could probably say, by Iran, and their pressuring of the Americans to include a ceasefire here in Lebanon as part of the memorandum of understanding between those two countries. There is also a separate track of negotiations that the Lebanese state has been trying to maintain with Israel. Now, they say that the reason for that is that it is about maintaining Lebanese sovereignty, that no other country, that no other group should speak on behalf of the Lebanese state. And so this is another round of these talks between Lebanese and Israeli representatives, which will be happening in Washington starting next week from the 23rd to the 25th of June. So this was another kind of preparatory call for that. What we know about what was discussed is, again, this affirmation of Lebanese sovereignty, affirming that they wanted to see a ceasefire, and the president thanked the US for their support in trying to bring that about.
Now, Heidi Pett reporting from Tyre in southern Lebanon. Thank you very much, Heidi. Noor O'Day is in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. Noor, I understand there's been a call. This is reported by NBC. Let me source this. This is reported by NBC that there's been a call between the U.S. President, Donald Trump, and someone in Israel. Unclear if that might be the Israeli Prime Minister himself, Benjamin Netanyahu. What do you know?
Well, we don't have specific news about a phone call from the U.S. president to the Israeli prime minister. There were reports that Secretary of State Marco Rubio would be calling Netanyahu to speak about Lebanon. That still might be happening. But all the programs, all the discussions right now in Israel, Cyril, are about the U.S., where the U.S. stands, what is the sentiment, how bad is the damage in the U.S.-Israeli relationship. There is a lot of anger that is being directed freely at the U.S. president, and that is quite unprecedented. But at the moment, the Israeli Prime Minister has domestic issues on his mind. 58% of Israelis believe he should pull out of elections. That's how much trouble he's in, because all the promises he made, Cyril, on Iran, on Lebanon, on changing the region, on reigning over the Middle East, none of those have materialized. And the expectation now is, on top of this ceasefire, the U.S. might compel Israel to, at the very least, scale back the presence of its occupying forces in southern Lebanon.
Noor, what is Israel currently saying about its military operations in Lebanon? We did say that in the last 24 hours, at least 40 people have been killed by Israeli military raids in the southern part of Lebanon. What is Israel saying about this?
Well, the Israeli Prime Minister only shared two things this Friday. One, a statement about ordering up to 150 airstrikes, and another of a video of those airstrikes. Israel says it's not part of the Memorandum of Understanding. It will not withdraw from a fifth of Lebanon it now occupies and considers a buffer zone. And the ambassador of Israel to the United States just repeated that sentiment on a statement in a statement on X. The Israeli army also published a map showing that yellow line demarking that buffer zone, Cyril, has expanded, not shrunk. And the Israeli army is basically caught up in all of this political turmoil. And the spokesperson of that army had to address those concerns. Take a listen.
Everything related to agreements that fall under the political realm is a matter for the political realm. We will continue to operate according to our instructions. As long as we have not received different instructions, we will continue to operate according to the directives that the Chief of Staff has given the forces on the ground.
Finally, given all of that's happening, Cyril, I have to say that a lot of the reporting also focuses on friends of Israel, specifically in the United States, who are advising the Israeli Prime Minister and his cabinet to tone it down because they cannot afford to lose the support of this U.S. president. And that is something novel in the relations between the two countries.
Al Jazeera's Noor O'Day reporting live from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. Thank you very much. Let's go to the White House. Al Jazeera's chief U.S. correspondent Alan Fisher is there. Alan, what can you tell us about U.S. diplomatic efforts right this moment? I mean, we know the U.S. Secretary of State has called the Lebanese president, and there is this report out there that Donald Trump has also put a phone call through to Israel.
Something's going on. Donald Trump should have left the Oval Office, left the White House an hour ago. He's been in the Oval Office for at least the last hour. There are reports that J.D. Vance was seen in the building. You can hear the noise of a motorcade as well, which suggests that may well actually be true. Donald Trump is just about to leave. He's going to be heading out. You can hear, well, I can hear the motorbikes revving up just outside the White House to escort him to Joint Base Andrews. He isn't helicoptering out as he would normally because the stage is still built for the big UFC fight here at the weekend. Donald Trump did speak to the Israelis. He's confirmed that. He told them that he wanted to see a ceasefire. I was telling you earlier that my reporting was that there had been conversations between the United States side and also the Israelis. Donald Trump didn't confirm whether or not he spoke to Benjamin Netanyahu, but he did say that sometimes Bibi just has to calm down and use your head, which certainly fits in with the pattern of how he's been addressing the Israeli Prime Minister, and is concerned that the fighting in southern Lebanon could derail his peace deal with Iran. He called the fighting between Hezbollah and Israel as a pinprick, and the much bigger picture was the peace between the United States and Iran. So there are diplomatic measures going on, including, as you say, the call between Rubio and President Aoun in Lebanon. It shows that America is trying to get these things back on track because, of course, we expected J.D. Vance in Switzerland overnight to be sitting across the table from the Iranians this morning.
Yeah, and Alan, earlier this week, the U.S. president signed a memorandum of understanding with the Iranians, and it was signed by his opposite number on the other side, the Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. That was all supposed to usher in a new phase of direct negotiations between the U.S. and Iran, face-to-face negotiations. They were supposed to be happening right there, as you know, where I am in central Switzerland. We were expecting, as you just said, J.D. Vance here. He's not here. Where are we right now in this diplomatic effort between the U.S. and Iran?
Of course, as James pointed out earlier, a lot of this stuff goes on behind the scenes and we can't see. It's a bit like the Wizard of Oz. We're never quite able to glimpse behind the curtain until it's almost the end. And so it appears that there are being a lot of diplomatic levers being pushed over the last few hours. Certainly J.D. Vance was preparing to head to Switzerland. The plane was fueled up, the press had been gathered, and then suddenly they decided it wasn't going to happen. They said it was about logistics. J.D. Vance earlier on Thursday said it was difficult for the Iranians to get out of Iran. It's not entirely clear how that would actually play out, but it's clear that there wasn't going to be someone on the other side of the table. And of course the US doesn't want to be in the position where the Vice President is sitting around kicking his heels. And so there is a determination to move this process forward. You can tell that by the calls we've seen over the last few hours. The US doesn't want this derailed, and of course the important thing in the back of their mind is the ticking clock. We're now 2 days into the 60 days, mutually extended if they agree, but 2 days into the 60, and they want to get a deal done soon.
Al Jazeera's Alan Fisher reporting from the White House. Alan, thank you very much. Going now to the Iranian capital, Tehran, our correspondent Mohammed Val is there. Mohammed, the Iranian deputy foreign minister spoke to Al Jazeera a little earlier today. What did he say?
Well, he basically said that there are preparations for an important negotiation with the Americans, but there must be a step-by-step process in this regard. 5 points have to be implemented, and those have been clarified earlier by the spokesman of the foreign ministry, saying that a comprehensive ceasefire, that's the first article in the memorandum of understanding. And aside from what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz, which is understandably the most smoothly going part of that agreement now, for now, he also mentioned Articles 10 and 11, which have to do with the process of lifting the sanctions eventually, and also the unfreezing of Iranian assets. He said that as per the memorandum of understanding, these 5 points have to get moving. I mean, the implementation of those points has to get moving from the very outset, and that the Iranians are actually monitoring the American behavior in this regard. And there is a lot at the same time of criticism, both by the spokesperson of the foreign ministry and by the deputy foreign minister regarding Lebanon and the Israeli actions there, saying that the US has to implement the terms of the agreement and has to prevent Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu from thwarting the efforts towards peace and stability. That is a hint there at the fact that the Prime Minister of Israel is doing what he can to derail this process, and that it is the responsibility of the Americans to prevent him from doing that. Lots of statements there, and the Iranians are talking about step by step. They are monitoring, and they want the Americans to start first and do what and to prove that they are serious about these negotiations.
Mohammed, what you're reporting is so important. I think it's being underreported at the moment, and our viewers need to understand this. So I want to go over some of this again. The Iranians are saying, and they have told Al Jazeera this, they're saying that they want the current memorandum of understanding that's been signed by them and by Donald Trump. They want that document to be implemented before they do what we're all expecting, which is face-to-face talks with the Americans on a final deal. So if we go down your list that you just reported of what Iran wants to see happen, and all of this, by the way, is in the current agreement. This is what the Americans and the Iranians have agreed to do. And Iran is saying, well, go ahead and do it, essentially. So some of those things are actually happening already. End the U.S. naval blockade, that's paragraph 4 of the MOU. That is, well, it's not ended, but it's been lifted. It's been paused or suspended. Paragraph 5, the maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz should restart. It is restarting, so that's happening. The export of Iranian oil, that has actually, I don't know if it's fully happening, but it is at least in part happening and has been happening since, well, for a good while now, since a few weeks into the war, when the U.S. waived some sanctions they had on the sale of Iranian oil. So we're left with two sticking points, and that's what I'm hoping you can talk us through, Mohammed. The Lebanon ceasefire and the unfreezing of Iranian assets.
Well, there has been more talking today here in Tehran about the ceasefire in Lebanon, but also they did not forget to talk about the unfreezing of sanctions. Both, particularly the spokesman of the Foreign Ministry earlier today, he spoke about the implementation of Articles 10 and 11, which include that. The Iranians, in this regard, are waiting for the Americans to do something, anything, in this respect, like the mechanisms that have been talked about in the Memorandum of Understanding have to be launched and put in motion. Something has to be announced in DC. We don't know the details about how much of those assets has to be unfrozen, has to be released for the moment. So there is no clarity about that. The modality of this, or the method according to which this is going to be implemented, is not clarified, hasn't been explained to us until now by the Iranians. But the sticking point, the most outstanding problem now today is Lebanon. They are saying that the Americans have the full responsibility to implement that article, and that means they have to push the Israelis, pressure the Israelis to implement it and to stop their attacks in Lebanon.
And Mohammed Val reporting from the Iranian capital, Tehran. Thank you very much for walking us through all of that. Thanks, Mohammed. Bringing in now our guest who has extensive experience in diplomacy, including crisis diplomacy and mediation. Martin Griffiths is with us on set. So good to see you again. Former Undersecretary General of the UN Humanitarian Affairs Office. You're also the director of Mediation Group International. And as I just pointed out, you have first-hand experience of mediating. For instance, a couple of years ago, you mediated the grain initiative between Ukraine and Russia, two parties that still are at war, did not trust each other, and still you were able to get things done.
That's the thing.
I'd like your perspective on how you mediate this.
I don't think you mediate it by ambiguity or ambition. And my worry, if I could explain that, my worry about the Memorandum of Understanding is very ambitious. I mean, ranging from its 60-day limit, or maybe extendable, ranging from its desire to have no war in Lebanon, which we've already seen overturned in the last few days, and so forth. A lack of clarity about whether tolls will be imposed again after the 60 days by Iran. Indeed, they're saying they will. So many things like that doesn't make you confident in the basic structures of a peace agreement. This isn't a peace agreement, I accept that. It's actually a statement of intent, Cyril, I think. And it's a good first step, and I think one must almost be constructive and optimistic about this. But it's left the difficult things for later. And I'm worried about that. And we've seen it this week here in Switzerland, haven't we?
But isn't that the point? To get to something, get to an agreement. It's of course not a final deal. It's of course, there are many details, more than details, in fact, that need to be hammered out. But it's something. Isn't that the point?
Look, the something here, which is really important and good, is a ceasefire. I mean, ideally and most importantly in Lebanon, but also in the Gulf and in Iran and in the Gulf region. People will live instead of dying. Obviously, that's incredibly important anyway, isn't it, in a universal sense. It's also important in terms of changing the culture of war, the logic of war in those various countries. So that's very important. Nobody can diminish that. My experience of ceasefires, and I've done quite a few, is that they fall apart because they've not got the mechanism to support it, they've not got monitoring, and they've not got essentially the will. And Gaza is, of course, the movie here that we've seen before on this. And it remarkably has a lot of, resonances. So yes, it's good, But I don't believe, from my own experience of mediation, that the idea of we'll take the low-hanging fruit and the rest will come because we are actually engaging is as convincing as people think. I don't think it works quite as easily as that.
So if you're the lead mediator in this case is Pakistan, and the supporting mediator, let's say, is Qatar, and they're here in Switzerland.
Yeah.
If you are the mediators right now, what do you do?
I'd like to plug the gaps in the language of the MOU. Not to change the MOU. The MOU is a statement of intent. It's a saying we will do these things. You don't have to change that. It's signed, as you say, and keep it signed in an asset. But what you do is say, how are we going to actually address the nuclear issue in 60 days? How are we going to really be sure that the Straits of Hormuz will be properly opened and untollable, if that's the right word, opened over time? How will we imagine this $300 billion reconstruction fund, which, by the way, doesn't even include Lebanon? I mean, it's a very odd arrangement. It's only about Iran. What about the Gulf? Actually, what about Israel in a way? So I think there's stuff there that needs to be sorted through, not as a long-term negotiation. That comes consequentially. But as an initial, if I was the mediators, I'd be saying, what about these obvious questions that the international community are asking us, the public are asking us now? How do we answer that credibly? And if we can answer it credibly, let's do it now.
Do personalities matter in this? I mean, on the one side of this negotiation, there is a mercurial American president, Donald Trump. He will tweet one thing, do another, or tweet one thing and then tweet a totally opposite thing. And on the other side of this is an Iranian supreme leader whom we hear from very infrequently. It is hard to read his mind. And the latest statement that he gave was, I was opposed to this deal, but I ended up being convinced that it could be a good idea, so I gave it a green light. Do personalities matter in something like this?
Even more in this than I think in most things, actually. I mean, personalities always matter in mediation because it's a matter of persuading the leaders, the key leaders, you've described them, as being willing to change their whole strategy towards not fighting instead of killing. That's a huge, huge responsibility. That's Nobel Prize territory, I think, if you can persuade your base to stop killing. And it's incredibly difficult because your base has said, but we've all died for nothing, and so forth. So, yes, leaders matter, but what really matters is advisors to those leaders who are listened to, who don't have so much skin in the game, who think about it a bit more in terms of time, who actually make sure there are discussions in each capital before statements are made. Very difficult to see that happening now. And finally, in that context, don't mess it about every day. Don't change the nature of money every day. And you know why, Cyril, why that I think is as important as anything else? Which is that the people affected by this war, they listen to these statements. They listen to what's happened here in Switzerland. They want hope. We've often talked about that. They're not getting it by contradictions and distractions and unpredictability. It's the worst thing for their resilience. And it undermines the natural path that a peace process should have. So you need to change the culture, but you also need these, this is what I think is so interesting, you need these great leaders on all sides, wherever they come from, to take the spirit of risk. They're all risking things, aren't they? And to take the risk for them personally, their politics, their country, and move it to the next step. So that's why the MOU is great. But that's also why the MOU is lacking.
Martin Griffiths, you're the former Under-Secretary General of the UN Humanitarian Affairs Office. We pointed out your experience in mediation a short while ago, and you came all the way to us here at the foot of the central Swiss mountains where negotiations may yet happen, direct talks, face-to-face talks between the US and Iran, and we appreciate you coming. Thank you very much, Martin Griffiths.
Thank you so much, Cyril. Great to be here. Thank you.
And since Martin was talking about the content of the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, this preliminary agreement that has been signed by Donald Trump and the Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian, a reminder of what is in this MOU. The U.S. and regional partners will develop, this is one of the points in the agreement, will develop a $300 billion fund for the reconstruction and economic development of Iran. Also in the agreement, all U.S. sanctions imposed on Iran could be removed. This would be part of a final deal. It is not starting yet. Frozen Iranian money, however, should be released according to this agreement, should be released starting now. The Strait of Hormuz will reopen to all commercial vessels. That has begun to happen. The U.S. will end its naval blockade on Iranian ports, also underway. And Iran agrees that it will not build, buy, procure nuclear weapons. Both sides have also agreed to dispose of Iran's highly enriched uranium. You would have heard the American President, Donald Trump, refer to it as the nuclear dust. Well, that could be either handed over to the U.S. or a third party, or at the very least, and that's spelled out in the agreement, it would have to be downblended. Joining us now, Ali Vaiz from Salzburg, director of the Iran Project at the International Crisis Group. Ali, it's also great to have you on the program. Can we start with your assessment of where we are in this negotiation, if we can even call it a negotiation at this point? Because the Iranians and the Americans are supposed to meet face to face. It was supposed to happen in Switzerland, and for the moment, it's not happening.
It's great to be with you. Look, this memorandum of understanding from an Iranian perspective is a double test for President Trump. It is a test to see if the United States in general, but also President Trump in particular, is willing and able to deliver on sanctions relief, given the sorry and sad history that exists, and it's a bipartisan problem. And second is a test to see if President Trump can rein in Prime Minister Netanyahu, because otherwise, from an Iranian perspective, no deal with the United States is worth the paper that it is written on.
So Iran has been pretty clear that they want a number of things to happen. In fact, we went through the list with our correspondent a little earlier in the program. It's 5 things. Now, of those 5 things, I think we can agree 3 are happening, right? Hormuz is being reopened. The commercial traffic is going through. The U.S. naval blockade is being, at least for now, suspended. And Iran is able, at least to some extent, to export some of its oil. So that's what's happening. What is in the agreement that isn't yet happening, you mentioned it, is the ceasefire in southern Lebanon. We've seen fighting today. 40 people have been killed in southern Lebanon fighting between Israel and Hezbollah. So that's not yet happening. And the unfreezing of Iranian money that is locked in banks and financial institutions around the world. Do you think those 2 things can happen? And then Iran comes to the negotiating table?
Of those 2 things, I think the Lebanon dimension is more difficult to solve because at the end of the day, the financial element here is in full control of the United States. And I do believe that there is real interest on the part of President Trump to resolve this crisis and walk away from it. And therefore, I can see that even without making a lot of noise about it, the United States will release some of these frozen assets to Iran. But the problem of Lebanon, of course, depends on the United States using its enormous leverage on Israel to hold Prime Minister Netanyahu back, and that hasn't fully happened yet.
All right, so I follow your logic then, and I understand why you're saying that there's really one main sticking point, one thing stopping the Americans and the Iranians from coming to the table for these face-to-face talks. You're saying it's Lebanon. Well, how does that get fixed then? Because Hezbollah and Israel, Hezbollah was created in the early 80s. We're in 2026. Hezbollah and Israel have been fighting on and off for almost half a century.
Right. Look, this is not going to get resolved in a fundamental way. What is needed at this stage is a ceasefire. And the ceasefire can happen if President Trump really puts his foot down, and not just by reprimanding Prime Minister Netanyahu, but actually putting pressure by holding back military assistance to Israel. That is the one point of leverage that the last president who used it was President Reagan, but it is definitely something that is available to President Trump. And from what I have seen, I am relatively cautiously optimistic that the president would use this leverage because he really wants to get this deal done and wants to see the Strait open and doesn't want to see relapse into conflict.
So Ali Vaez, assuming that happens and guns go silent in southern Lebanon, and that creates enough space for Iran and the U.S. to both come to the negotiating table, then we move on to what is Donald Trump's priority and what is Iran's priority. Iran wants economic sanctions lifted. Donald Trump says, well, that happens if I can guarantee that Iran never has a path to a nuclear weapon, right? That is the core of all of this. Do you think the U.S. can get to that point?
Look, when it gets to getting to a final agreement, I'm actually quite cynical. I do believe that it is very difficult and very ambitious to get an agreement in the course of 60 days. There is a long history of very lengthy negotiations to try to resolve the nuclear issue. It's very technical. There's a lot of mistrust. But I do believe that because the 60-day is extendable, probably both sides are going to remain in the MOU land for a period of time because simply there is no better alternative. The question really is that at some point, would Iran be willing to de-link the question of Lebanon from the continuation of its diplomatic engagement with the United States? It cannot afford to do it now, but 6 months from now, a year from now, it might be a different situation. And again, I don't believe that we can get to a final agreement. There might be room for some additional incremental understandings between the two sides. For instance, restoring the UN inspectors' access to Iran in return for some additional sanctions relief. But to imagine that both sides will be able to resolve everything at once, the $300 billion fund, the nuclear issue, inspections, I think it is a bit far-fetched.
Ali, can you tell me more on that? You're saying you do not expect a final agreement. You're expecting incremental agreements, perhaps, but not a final deal. Explain that.
Well, look, there is already the experience of the Gaza ceasefire, which never went into phase 2. So it is quite possible that this deal also remains at phase 1 and never goes into phase 2. It is, in a way, also a more digestible solution for the United States because Iran is not currently enriching uranium. Its nuclear program is suspended. And if the Strait is open, we are back to status quo ante that really doesn't have a lot of urgency for Washington. The situation will have urgency for Iran because it will be in desperate need of economic reprieve. And so it's not necessarily in the medium to long term a sustainable situation. But the Iranians might also conclude, given how difficult it was to even get to a 1.5-page agreement with the Trump administration, and how difficult it is to even implement this MOU, they might also conclude that they might have to wait President Trump out. So I can't imagine a world in which we will remain just at this stage and both sides would wait for another opportunity.
Ali Vaez, director of the Iran project at the International Crisis Group, joining us from Salzburg today. Thank you very much. Great to have you on the program.
Thank you.
Now, bringing this to our viewers, the diplomatic efforts underway here in Switzerland. Here's some evidence of Qatar's delegation and their involvement. Well, Qatar's Prime Minister Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani has met Switzerland's foreign minister to affirm the Gulf states' support for talks between the U.S. and Iran. A reminder that Qatar is one of the mediators, along with Pakistan, which has often been described as the lead mediator in these talks between the United States and Iran. So the Qatari delegation here in Switzerland ready in the event of face-to-face talks, which have not been cancelled, have been so far delayed. Well, Abdullah Bandar al-Taibi is an assistant professor in international affairs at Qatar University, and he says that Iranians and the U.S. must pursue long-term solutions through dialogue.
What we witness in the region is something we haven't seen before. We've seen missiles, projectiles in the GCC skies as a result of this war. That the regional countries did not choose to be part of it and did not want did not actually want it to start at the beginning, and they prefer to have dialogue. Now it's the importance to focus more on de-escalation and to keep going with the first meeting between Iran and the US. This is quite important at the moment for to build trust between two conflicting parties. But this time is very historic moment for the regional countries and for Pakistan, Qatar, and all regional countries, because now they are the bridge basically between the US and Iran, and they could put their interests on the table as well in terms of so many things. The navigation, for example, has been one of the main issues. Also using the region as a bargaining chip when dealing with the US. Therefore, I think trust is something quite important, but what's really important is to focus more on the regional stability and to have a regional understanding that the region should not be thrown under the bus like what Iran did by just firing missiles towards regional countries. And this is quite important. Therefore, for trust to be built, it's actually on the Iranian side to show some sort of, to be trustworthy basically in their negotiations with the US, and also when it comes to negotiations with and talks and dealings with the regional countries in terms of other issues such as the stability, the navigation, and also targeting energy.
From the Qatari capital, Doha, you're an assistant professor of international politics and security at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Mohamed, as things stand, what, in your view, is the biggest impediment to these face-to-face talks actually happening here in Switzerland?
Well, I think the main impediment which both sides are facing now is basically the comprehensive ceasefire, something that the Iranian side has been very much insisting on. And what is happening in Lebanon is partly because the Iranians are insisting on keeping Lebanon outside the, if you like, the borders of the war. But also it's a test. The Iranians are trying to watch whether the United States can actually control or rein in the Israeli side. Because if the American side wouldn't be able to stop Israel attacking Lebanon, who would guarantee that in the future Israel wouldn't attack Iran itself? And the Israeli side did that last June. So I think for the Iranians it's very important to see how much the US has leverage over Israel in this, in these negotiations, and whether they could guarantee that Israel would abide by the terms of any upcoming, if you like, negotiations or any upcoming agreements.
Mohamed, explain to me Iran's role and leverage in this, because I have to tell you that most of our guests have said, well, yes, a ceasefire in southern Lebanon is the main impediment to talks, but that means, in their view, usually, Israel is the main impediment to talks, because Israel is the one that, as soon as there's a ceasefire, they'll bomb southern Lebanon again and they'll fight Hezbollah again, and they refuse to be bound by the terms of the MOU. But you just pointed out, first thing you said was Iran here has a role to play. So explain that.
Well, what does that mean? Basically, the Israeli side is claiming that there is fire coming from Lebanon. And so it's both sides' responsibility to make sure that there is no fire coming from Lebanon. But what I said earlier, basically, is that for the Iranians, it's not only that they want to protect the Lebanese side, the Hezbollah, they want to make sure that the United States can control Israel in the future, because, the scenario is there. The Israelis could actually, at some point in the future, even if there is an agreement between the United States and Iran on issues such as the nuclear file and other things, Israel could attack again Iran. So they want to make sure that Israel would abide by the current agreement, and that they would not attack Lebanon as a test, that they would not do the same thing to Iran. So for both sides, they have to play a role. And also Hezbollah is being accused by the Israeli side that they are attacking the Israelis. So would Iran be able to rein in Hezbollah and make sure that Hezbollah would never attack the Israeli side? But I think I agree with other guests that yes, the problem is the Israeli side so far. But at the same time, that I think it's not only about Lebanon, it's also about Iran itself, and they want to make sure that nobody would attack them in the future, including Israel.
Mohanad Saloom joining us from Doha this hour. You're Assistant Professor of International Politics and Security at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Professor Saloom, thank you very much for joining us on Al Jazeera. And with that, I turn back to our diplomatic editor, James Bays. James, at this hour, as the sun sets on Switzerland, where are we in these talks? Is this going to get off the ground?
These things always have setbacks, and both sides do not want to go back to war. That's the key point. And I think the Iranian side is taking it slow, using some leverage it has right now after the way President Trump has embraced this deal. They feel that they can push a bit and get him to push Israel a bit. I think another observation, yes, that may be their main motive because they want to get the Lebanon issue sorted. But diplomats who worked on this over the years, European diplomats, American diplomats I've spoken to, they always praise the Iranian diplomats. They are masters of their brief. They're very, very good negotiators. But they always like to take it slowly, very, very slowly. Think about it for a bit. Yes, it could be extended, but 60 days. Where will we be at the end of 60 days? Well, by then, Trump's armada will have gone back away from Iran. So the imminent threat of the sort of bombardment that of course he can bomb, but the sort of operation that he carried out will have gone. And where will the United States be? 2 and a bit months away from the midterm elections. Political suicide to launch the war again.
How does this compare, given that you've covered the most sensitive talks, peace talks, negotiations, mediation of, this century, essentially, the last 2 decades? How does this compare?
This one is moving. Take you back to the Syria peace talks. They never went anywhere at all. They went round and round in circles. The Assad regime managed to stop diplomacy, delay diplomacy at every single stage. This is a process that's going somewhere because both sides do not want to go back to war. Having said that, I heard what Martin Griffiths said and Ali Vyas said earlier on. I do think there's a possibility what Ali Vyas said is possible, that this memorandum of understanding period will continue, roll on, go nowhere, eventually become a memorandum of misunderstanding.
But this is really interesting because, and I had not thought of this until I heard Ali Vyas bring this up, we're so focused on negotiations, face-to-face talks, reaching 60-day clock to reach a final agreement. And you're saying you agree with the idea that there may never be a final agreement?
I think there could be an agreement. I think both sides
there
could be an agreement, and there could be a brand new future for Iran and its relations with the United States. But of course, the United States has to change a fair bit there too. But there is also another scenario where we have a sort of non-agreement, non-war continuing. Pretty much, I'm afraid, the status quo that we've had for some years now.
James Bays, Al Jazeera's diplomatic editor, thank you very much. Now, just before we hand back to our Doha global headquarters, a final look at that Swiss mountaintop there, the resort of Burgenstock. The Swiss are ready to help facilitate talks between the U.S. and Iran. The banners are up. Mediator Qatar is here in Switzerland. They've met the foreign ministry. The Iranians and the Americans are the ones who are not here. They're ones who are expected to meet for face-to-face talks. We're not there yet, but it could still happen. And with that, back to Doha.